I'm Bill Potter. It's my pleasure to moderate our discussion today. And I'm especially delighted to welcome our featured speaker, the newly anointed Distinguished Professor of Practice, Dr. Siegfried Hecker, someone whom I've worked with for a very long period of time, whom I've kind of coveted over the years, particularly during the 17 years that he spent at Stanford University, and before that as director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. As some of you have heard me mention, previously, when I see Sig, in my mind, I see a Soviet marshal with maybe 20 medals, different medals having to do with his awards as the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Award for Science Diplomacy, the University of California's President's Medal, and the Enrico Fermi Award from the President of the United States and the U.S. Department of Energy, among many. There's not enough space on Sig's chest to hold all of these medals. But in addition to being a very, very distinguished scientist and a communicator of science to policymakers, he's also an accomplished scholar, and I probably should have brought his hefty 2-volume study called Doomed to Cooperate, which is really a fascinating collection of American and Soviet/Russian scientist commentary on U.S., Soviet, and Russian cooperation in the nuclear sphere. Where Stanford University Press, a little bit more accommodating, I'd also display his now forthcoming book dealing with the DPRK's nuclear program, but that's for a future seminar. Rather than my taking up more time here, Sig, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Monterey, and I'm speaking on behalf of everybody in the room and those who are also connected virtually to say how pleased it is for us to have you here. So please.
Thank you, Bill. I have permission from Dr. Potter to speak without the mask. That way also gives me a chance to get some water and make sure you can hear me. So indeed, it's my great pleasure to be here with all of you and also all of you out there in the virtual world. Senator Nunn, I see you sitting out there. It's a great pleasure to see you and so many of the distinguished people here. So in about a month after the invasion of Ukraine, I did an interview with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I talked about that. From what I saw, it looked like Putin had blown up the global nuclear order. That was now over 5 months ago. And what I thought was particularly important is that one thinks about how you're going to put a nuclear order back together. And so I thought, what a good group this would be to have this sort of discussion, because quite frankly, this is not a presentation of what's out there. I don't know what's going to happen. But I would indeed like to have that discussion. But there are people like me, and there are people like Professor Chefrinov, who sort of put this global nuclear order out there. We believe there's a global nuclear. However, is there really a global nuclear? Was there a global nuclear order before Ukraine? And let's just say not just this February. But let's say 2014, before Crimea. So I'd like to know how many of you believe that there was actually a global nuclear order. So if you believe so, raise your hand. Okay, well, there are actually some real prominent dissenters, like Professor Duvries and some others. So it isn't so clear to a lot of people, since I've traveled a lot around the world, and certainly much in Russia, but also China, North Korea, Pakistan, India, etc., and of course the European countries. And so the further you get away from the European countries, the more countries would actually say, what do you mean by a global nuclear order? You know, whatever is out there is discriminatory as hell. You guys sort of created this and you call it the global nuclear order. But at least as I look back, and of course I can't look back into the pre-World War II days because it turns out I was born in 1943. As it turns out, actually about 20 kilometers from the current Ukrainian border in Poland of Austrian parents. But as I look back into that first half of the 20th century, I mean, for heaven's sakes, that was disorder. Some 90 million people or so were killed in war. And so if you plot the number of people killed in war as a function of time, it just goes up. Of course, First World War, enormous, Second World War. And then in 1945, which happens to coincide with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it just drops enormously. And of course, still a lot of people, millions have gotten killed, but not tens of millions have gotten killed. So something changed with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And to me, at least, the world sort of recognized that, look, we don't want to go there and use these weapons because they're so destructive. And as you well know, I mean, when you split the nucleus, you're talking about millions of times the energy release compared to what you release with electrons by burning fossil fuels or by TNT or whatever. And so you were dealing with a totally different force, and people seem to recognize that. Of course, we did have the Cold War. We did have this enormous competition between the US and the Soviet Union. However, somehow we are here today, and nuclear weapons have not been used again since 1945. And if you look back over history, I mean, that is truly unusual that this sort of a step function increase in destructive power was then not used. And so to me, a global nuclear order has developed over these 70 years or so. And I look at it at least from sort of four things that to me are very important. The most important part of that is the no use of nuclear weapons, such as that they have not been used. You know, some people call it a nuclear taboo. Nina Tannenwald has written very nicely about that. But the real point is nuclear weapons have not been used since August of 1945. And that is quite an accomplishment. The second part is that, in the end, people were concerned for many, many years, and still are concerned, that there are going to be more fingers on the nuclear trigger. In other words, the proliferation problem. So if you look at that over the years, we have less than 10 countries in the world that we know have nuclear weapons, so at least have demonstrated their nuclear weapons capability through nuclear tests. And if you look at, compared to what we were concerned about some decades ago, what President Kennedy was concerned about, thinking there'd be 25 to 30 nuclear weapons nuclear weapon states by the end of the 1960s, that didn't happen. The third part is nuclear weapons have not only been not used by the major powers, but they have not been detonated by terrorists. In fact, not only no mushroom cloud, a real nuclear explosion, but in fact, no radiological materials have been detonated by terrorists. And so we haven't had a dirty bomb explode. That I find really quite remarkable. But there's one other piece then, the fourth piece to what I consider the global nuclear order, and that is the benefits of that factor of millions. The benefits have been, we've had nuclear electricity around the world through nuclear power. And for the most part, over the last 30 years or so, that's been more than 10% of the world's power, with essentially very little carbon. In our country, in the United States, it was 20% for quite a while, so a fifth of the electricity generated by nuclear electricity. And then nuclear medicine. Usually people don't stop and think about that, but in nuclear medicine, there's some 40 million people in the world that take advantage of either diagnostics or therapeutics from nuclear medicine. So that was the benefit. So to me, sort of the global nuclear order boils down to a very simple sort of comparison, and that is, here you have this enormous power of the nucleus. Can you actually, do things to get more of the benefits of that power, and then manage the downside, the risks of that? And so it's the comparison of the risk and the benefits. And so a nuclear order would take you up on the side that the benefits are there that outweigh the risks. So to me, that's been a very positive aspect of the 70-some years, since the end of World War II. And so how has the invasion of Ukraine, changed that? Well, in terms of the no use of nuclear weapons, right off the bat, President Putin pretty much threatened the use, that things are going to happen that are worse than anything that you've ever seen. Well, that was certainly quite an overt threat to use nuclear weapons. And others in Russia have also had pretty loose language about the idea of the use of nuclear weapons. What I wrote, what I said in the interview with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I wasn't overly concerned that that's going to happen right away. To me, it seemed a lot like the sort of the positioning of Putin, of making sure that we all remembered, that he does have a nuclear arsenal. So he was threatening. But I also said, the risk was not zero. And I still believe that today. And so there's still this question, under what sort of circumstances would Russia, and this means mostly Putin, actually potentially use nuclear weapons. And so we're threatening the no use more than we've been for quite some time. As far as the non-proliferation regime, of course, the real expert here on the Non-Proliferation Treaty is my good colleague, Dr. Bill Potter. He spent a good part of his professional life, trying to make sure that we actually get this treaty in the end, actually into law and recognized by everyone. And of course, the whole issue of non-proliferation, I think of it, in much more global terms. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is the central element of the non-proliferation regime. But the regime, is this complicated fabric of treaties, agreements, practices, international organizations, understandings, security alliances and guarantees, and so forth. And so as I look at the non-proliferation regime today, that's threatened substantially by what Putin has done. And as you well know, there was this 1994 Budapest agreement, and he just shredded that Budapest agreement. So here was an agreement, where Russia signed on the dotted line that not only will we not use nuclear weapons against you, not only will we not invade you, but we won't threaten you. We won't threaten your sovereignty. And obviously, that's gone out the window. And so what is that for other countries as they look at whatever guarantees have been made? So that's really a significant issue. And if you look at then at that non-proliferation regime, however, this is not something that the United States alone has developed, although I just saw an advertisement for a new book by Rebecca Davis Gibbons, who I don't know myself, But the book is titled The Hegemon's Toolkit. Jeffrey, have you actually seen the book, or?
I haven't seen the book yet, but I know Rebecca pretty well.
Okay. So she talks about the incredible role and the important role the United States played in bringing this non-proliferation regime about. And that's true. United States certainly played a leading role, but we could have not done this without the Soviet Union and without Russia. And the Soviet Union and Russia played a really significant role. So what they figured out, in spite of the fact that we were aiming bombs against each other, that we had to cooperate. And actually, that's one of the places where the book title came from, that we were doomed to cooperate. And in the non-proliferation arena, we were really doomed if we did not cooperate. And so the Soviet Union was such an important part. Russia has been an important part, for the last almost 30 years. And now one has to worry about what's going to happen now. Okay, if we look at the issue of nuclear terrorism, again, we worked very closely with the Soviet Union, then particularly with Russia after the demise of the Soviet Union. I personally worked a lot with the Russians on the issue of nuclear terrorism. My good colleague Glenn Schweitzer from the State Department, then eventually from the National Academies, we held numerous workshops, both in the United States as well as in Russia, realizing that we had to work together to make sure that we would prevent nuclear terrorism, including dirty bombs, radiological terrorism around the world. And we did, and we worked closely together. Well, and we've taken nuclear power. After 9/11 in the United States, there was sort of a quick check to see our nuclear power plants are actually resistant to having a fully loaded, fueled big plane that would run into a nuclear power plant. And actually, things had to be done to improve that. So we worried about terrorists somehow attacking a nuclear power plant. We worry about terrorists cutting off the electric supply, as Mother Nature did at Fukushima, for example. So we worried about terrorists. And what happened with Ukraine is we now had a state-sponsored terrorism. If you looked at what Putin did, first of all, his military did, is they went into Chernobyl. Actually, in terms of the potential overall devastation, it wasn't there. But what they did to go into the Chernobyl exclusion area, it was just absurd. You don't send your soldiers into a place where you do have radioactive contaminant, and they did. And then, of course, we have Zaporizhzhia, where they're using the nuclear plant as a military base. And of course, there's still lots of controversy as to who's done what and who's attacked what. But the bottom line is, you don't go set up a military base at a nuclear facility. And so I worry more now about the issue of terrorism, whether it's state-sponsored or non-state actors. And then the question of civilian use of nuclear energy. Again, the Soviet Union actually played a pretty responsible role. If you look at what they did in the Soviet Eastern Bloc, is they put reactors into many different countries, and they did it very responsibly. They did it in such a way to make sure that those countries did not develop nuclear weapons. And of course, there were safety concerns, and we had Chernobyl. I think Russia, after Chernobyl, then made a remarkable recovery in the nuclear power arena, has become a very responsible state, and actually, to some extent, does things more so and better than anybody else. For example, in enrichment, enriching the uranium for light water reactor fuel, they control about 35% of the world's capacity for enrichment. So a lot of the world depends on Russia for enrichment services. It's the only country that agrees to take back fuel. So in other words, if you build a Soviet reactor, you run that reactor, Russian, I should say, Russia will take the fuel back. So it plays a critical part in the nuclear energy business. And now I have to ask, I mean, who in the world would want to buy a nuclear reactor from Russia? They just took this place at Zaporizhzhia and they used that as a military base. You know, what sort of a responsible partner are they in doing this in the nuclear world? Those are the points that I want to make. That's why I'm concerned about the nuclear order. How are we going to rebuild that without Russia? How would we rebuild it with Russia under the circumstances, you know, where we have this unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country? Some of those things we can learn from past experience, and at least as I look back, the last time the global order changed as dramatically was with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And we can go back and take a look from the lessons learned as to what happened then. And in spite of the fact that today you actually hear quite a bit that, you know, to some extent, maybe the United States is responsible for what Russia is actually doing, you know, the question of NATO expansion, etc., and that some people are concerned that perhaps the US sort of did all the wrong things as far as Russia is concerned. I would maintain that right as the Soviet Union dissolved, what the United States did was just absolutely first-rate. So people like President George H.W. Bush, he made sure that Russia, from Soviet to Russia transition, they'd actually have a soft landing, so-called presidential initiatives. Then we have, and we have one of my heroes here watching from a distance, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, the Nunn-Lugar Act. Now, for heaven's sake, if that wasn't there working hand in hand, you know, with the former adversary, the United States can stand tall. How did it come about? It turns out academic community was involved. We at the National Lab, since I was at Los Alamos, we were involved. We were given the overall umbrella of both the political cover and the financial help in order to be able to make those things happen. So, for example, we at the labs at Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, and some of the other labs, we ran these lab-to-lab programs of working directly with our former adversaries at the Russian labs. And so we look back at that, and then of course we can also now track as to what happened, you know, from the early 1990s to now. And, you know, lots of things have gone to hell in the meantime, quite frankly. But at least at that time, sort of the right things were done for the adversaries as the change to work together. So the global order changed and the global nuclear order changed. Okay, so that's sort of the end of my presentation as such, and now I get to the question part. Okay, so what do we do now? And that's where, you know, I very much appreciate some feedback from those in the room, or also from those virtually. So how do we tackle the first one, the no use part? So what about arms control? What about strategic stability in the very world that we're in now? Should the U.S. still seek cooperation with the Russians, or is it impossible? You know, because of this unprovoked invasion. So, for example, in my opinion, I think President Biden has been pretty careful not to fully close the door. You know, this issue of declaring Russia to be a state sponsoring terrorism. That closes a lot of doors. In my opinion, I mean, they sure as hell are. You know, there is terrorism in Russia, but on the other hand, you really have to think through as to what sort of doors that you leave open. So let me stop at this point, Bill. Actually, see what comments, and then I have a bunch of other questions related to nuclear proliferation, terrorism, nuclear energy. But I don't want to go on forever, and open it up and see what comments or questions people have, and then I'll come back with more.
Thanks so much, Sig, and I will not take the floor initially to ask questions, but let me, since we do have Senator Nunn on the line here, I want to make sure that we don't become consumed with the people in the room here, and given his prominent role in addressing these kinds of issues. Senator, if you would care to venture into our conversation at this point, I would be delighted to call upon you, or if you wish to speak later, that's also fine. But would you like to say a few words, Sam?
Yeah, well, Sig always has a brilliant approach, and I would endorse everything he's said, including his question as to what we do now. I think we're all going to have to really think about that very seriously. And I don't think there are easy answers. This is not the answer or even the beginning of the answer, but it's basically this basic thought of mine is it may be a little bit too pessimistic, but I do think it's part of the problem, and that is
Senator, we just lost.
in one sense, if you define deterrence, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think
I'll
we
see.
lost you for a moment, but I think you're back
Yeah.
on.
Okay, I'll get a little bit closer here. In one sense, if you define deterrence broadly and not just nuclear, but nuclear being one very important component of deterrence, it certainly includes a whole lot of items, including economic and political. And in one sense of the word, both the United States and Europe and also Russia failed in their efforts to deter the other side. We and Europe tried to deter Russia's invasion. We predicted it. We released intelligence very skillfully so that they could not get away, at least in the world, with the big lie. We basically made it known to them, both privately and publicly, that there were going to be very severe economic sanctions, political sanctions. So we did a great deal to try to deter their invasion of Ukraine. And we failed to do that. Now, nuclear did not come into it. Article 5 didn't come into it because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But nevertheless, there was a very significant effort to deter in the broad sense, not in the pure nuclear sense. Then, as Sig already mentioned, Putin tried to deter any other country from interfering in his, quote, military operation, end quote, which was really an all-out invasion. He even threatened to use nuclear weapons implicitly, and it wasn't very subtle. And he failed in that deterrence effort. So in effect, Russia's effort to use conventional overwhelming power, which turns out not to be so overwhelming, and his implicit threat of using nuclear weapons, which I think was extremely reckless and has probably done as much as anything to disrupt the nuclear order. As I view the nuclear order, we have had one, as Sig said, all along, but it had severely eroded. All sorts of things we could go into as to why it eroded. Nevertheless, what Putin did in implicitly threatening nuclear weapons shortly after the P5 quoted Gorbachev and Reagan and endorsed their position that nuclear war must not be fought and cannot be won. So in effect, we've had the two countries that control most of the nuclear weapons in the world and most of the nuclear materials basically try to deter the other one. US, Europe tried to deter the conventional invasion, which was, I view it as a march of folly, and will cause so much suffering in Europe, Ukraine, first and foremost. And of course, Putin failed, even though he tried to use the nuclear threat to keep us from intervening. And we have intervened in a major way in terms of military equipment and timely intelligence, and we continue to. And of course, that has helped the Ukrainians, the brave, courageous Ukrainians, hopefully turn the tide in a more favorable direction. So I'm adding to the problem. I think the disruption to the nuclear order, even though it was already eroding, is very, very serious, very, very difficult to determine where we go from here. I wish I had the clear answers. I'm going to be listening for those. So thank you, Sig, and thank you, Bill, and all who participating. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much. So, Sig will, I'm sure, comment also on the Senator's remarks, but I'm pleased to call upon others who may wish to engage here. Are there someone who would like to take the floor? Well, let me, if I can, I mean, as we wait, okay, Abner's never at a loss.
Well,
Abner Cohen, for those of you who can't see him here. Go ahead, Abner.
I'm very unfortunately right now in the negative position that as of now there is very, very little to do. I think the world has expressed in a variety of ways what would be the impact if Russia would ever use in tactical nuclear weapons, even warning. I think it would be completely outrageous and the world responds accordingly, and I think the Russians know that. But in terms of getting something more concrete that involves conversation, I think the situation right now is so bad that it's just difficult for me, maybe lack of imagination, to see how conversation can be made. I think even in terms of Ukraine at the present time, and by the way, what happened in the last few weeks with the counteroffensive of Ukraine, it raised not very severely as of now, but it created a situation that the likelihood, which was low, and I hope it will stay low, is slightly higher because the Russian may come to a situation that will be more and more considered of last resort, as more and more territories is being taken from them, and the fact that they are so weak conventionally, they may think of all sorts of ideas in terms of warning just to freeze the situation. So I agree with you. We are far from zero. I don't think it's high, but we are far from zero. But even, and that will be my last point, even to see a situation that would lead to some kind of conversation, let alone formal talk about ceasefire in Ukraine itself is very, very difficult. Let alone to go to the more complex issue of conversation between Russia and the rest of the world. So my personal view is, as of now, it's pessimistic. I just do not see. I think the Russians know that the response will be overwhelming, very, very negative. But beyond that, I just don't see it. So.
If I,
No, go ahead.
So, I mean, I normally could weigh in on the side of the pessimist, and I probably will by the end of the seminar session today. But let me, just for maybe for a different perspective, having spent a month last month at the NPT Review Conference, and notwithstanding the fact that ultimately Russia blocked consensus over 4 articles dealing with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and another one dealing with the Budapest Memorandum. That said, in fact, there were very extended discussions, deliberations dealing with nuclear disarmament, dealing with non-proliferation, dealing with peaceful uses, in which, for the most part, the Americans and the Russians were not the parties who were at odds with one another. There certainly were, shrill moments during the course of the deliberations. Oddly enough, the most shrill moment probably until the very last part of the conference involved Argentina and France over the Falkland Islands. Malvinas Islands, picking up on your. I'm not exaggerating. The first day, the French foreign minister tore into the British, and the British ambassador had to exercise the right of reply. And there was a great deal of contention involving the United States and China, which was more assertive than anyone has ever seen in the context of the NPT. But at least in terms of the civility of the deliberations between the United States
and Russia and other parties.
This was a much more civil dialogue at this review conference than at the 2018-2019 prep conference. So it was possible in this context to have deliberations. Now, the contrary view, I was put it out there. I mean, it's a very interesting piece by one of our colleagues, Dr. Hananote, from our Vienna office in today's issue of Foreign Policy, which looks at kind of a change in the Russian attitude toward multilateral forum and diplomacy more generally, as they kind of withdraw. They now kind of condemn the Swiss for not being a neutral party. They don't want to have meetings in Geneva anymore. There is a real questioning of what it means in terms of multilateral diplomacy, if in fact, as was the case yesterday at the International Atomic Energy Agency, where 27 of the countries of the 35-member board voted to basically condemn the Russian occupation of the plant, called upon their removal, withdrawal from the plant. And so they are kind of redefining what it means to be have a multilateral dialogue. But still, I think more so than I anticipated, there was a civility in the discussions. So I just put that out there as another possible perspective. Sig, you wanted to?
No, yeah, let me just say a few things in concert, in response to what Abner said. Right now, of course, there isn't much hope for optimism for all the reasons that you have said as to what can be done with the Russians at all. And in fact, I myself, as I keep watching daily sort of what's happening on the ground, I have these mixed feelings. On one hand, it's really nice to see the Ukrainians push the Russians back. On the other hand, I keep saying, my God, how's this going to wind up? Because in the end, Russia's got the big guns over there. I don't think they've used all their big conventional guns yet that they can use. And then, of course, they have the nuclear guns left behind. And so I just keep wondering, how much is Russia going to take before it comes back and lashes out in a way, that will really, really make things difficult. I also don't have much hope there. But actually, so what I'm looking at right now, that situation is so complex. And I don't know where it's going to go. So I'm looking more ahead to say, once this thing is over, in whatever way it's over, so I maintain in the nuclear arena, to get nuclear right, you have to cooperate. And so how in the world do we re-engage at that point? And then how do we bring in the Chinese? I didn't talk about China and the nuclear order because they play much more of a smaller role. But I've worked very closely with the Chinese. They have had nowhere near the role that either the U.S. or Russia played in sort of the global non-proliferation regime. They've done rather little, but they've been moving up in terms of their capability to build nuclear reactors. They're pretty good at that now. And so they're going to put nuclear reactors around the world. I've worked with them on nuclear terrorism, actually for the 2008 Olympics. In Beijing, we were able to work together, and of course things are changing at the same time dramatically with China, and so all of this has become complex. And what I'd like to think through, and that's what organizations like NTI, organizations like the center here, in my opinion, should be thinking ahead. To say what could be done, when the war is over, and then what could be done in the meantime. For example, if you look at the history of the sort of cooperation and dialogue between Soviet Union and the United States, we actually had a lot of dialogue. Believe it or not, in this place called Los Alamos, which was my home for so many years. The Soviets first showed up in 1958. They actually visited the Los Alamos at that time. It was called the Scientific Laboratory. We worked during my tenure as director of Los Alamos, 86 to 97, so before the Soviet Union dissolved, we did neutrino experiments together with the Soviets in the Baksan mountains. So we did things then, and the military actually had contact with each other. And those contacts then came in extremely handy when the world opened up and we had a chance to actually work together. But it was based not on having nothing beforehand. So in my opinion, and that was particularly reinforced in the close working with the Russians, Bill has heard me say this so often, he's probably sick of it, but I've been to Russia 57 times, all working in the spirit of cooperation to make the world a safer place, and we have to work together if we're going to make it safer. So my contention on the basis of that experience, which holds all the way through to this very day, that actually the nuclear weapons complex in Russia is those people, particularly the leadership of those places, of their laboratories, they are a strong part of the civil society of Russia. And they will be there, in my opinion, as the people we can draw on, because they have the same senses as I do. They say, it doesn't make sense to move away from this global nuclear order. It's too dangerous to do that. So I think they would be there. We could try to enlist them. The military, particularly the strategic military people, Bill has had many of the Russians here, General Maslin, Viktor Yesin, for example. They're the same. I mean, they're part of the civil society. You want to be able to draw on those, so you don't want to lose those people. The young generation, when actually after Crimea, when Russia cut off essentially all of our lab-to-lab cooperation, the nuclear labs could work together. What I did at that time is I went deeper to younger, and so I had a young professionals nuclear forum between Russia and the United States. And my colleague Alla Kasyanova, who's here from Stanford, she worked that with me. And so we got young people together to talk about all of these nuclear things. And it was so fantastic. How do we not lose all of that? So that's sort of my mission, or what I'm after. What could we do now to keep the flame alive? Because if the flame is out, the pilot light is out too long, it's sort of more difficult to restart. So,
Thanks. We have some of those young people in the room today, so they may want to weigh in as well. I see that my colleague from Monterey, Jessica Varnum, is on the line. I think he's in Maine at the moment, and Jean Dupree has hand up. But I wanted to encourage some of the younger folks in the room here to feel comfortable raising their hand and asking questions. Just why don't I turn to you, and if you want to speak loudly so everyone can hear you, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Jessica Varnum. I'm the Deputy Director of CNS, and unfortunately I'm on the East Coast currently, but so glad I can call in to hear this, Sig. I was curious. I think you're absolutely correct to point to the success and probable continued success of lower levels of cooperation among scientists, youth, etc. And I think the thing that I am wrestling with presently in terms of the future of the nuclear order and the potential for cooperation with Russia is we seem to be facing a pretty severe breakdown of either the rational actor assumption in terms of Russia's current leadership, or we have a very different way of being rational and we don't understand the rational thinking behind what's going on, in the sense that I find it utterly irrational to think about leadership thinking that shelling nuclear plants that could hurt Russians as much as anyone else is a rational decision. I find a lot of the thinking around the possibility of a nuclear attack to be irrational. And so I cannot tell at this point if we have a rationality gap that makes it really complex in my mind to think about using any of the methods we've used in the past to try and negotiate. and I'd love your thoughts on that. If the rational actor assumption is not at play between our thinking and mainly Putin's thinking about nuclear attack, possible use of nuclear weapons, the shelling of nuclear power plants, these kinds of things that we would generally historically have considered to be unacceptable risks on both sides, then how do we move past that to cooperate if the thinking is not historically what it was about these things?
So Jessica, that's a very good question. That's precisely my question. That's why I'm here. Because I don't know the answer to that. You know, whenever I think that through, I say, well, we got to get past the irrational leadership. What I was just mentioning, the scientists, I mean, you know, way up the nuclear ladder to the leadership, they're not irrational. They don't think like that. We can come to resolution. They wouldn't go into Zaporizhzhia, you know, and use it as a military base. And they wouldn't think, you know, necessarily of using nuclear weapons the way that Putin has threatened it for the reason that he's threatened it. So the irrationality at this point is on the side of the leadership. And then, of course, I mean, the simple thing to think is to say, well, you know, Putin isn't going to last forever. But, you know, there are others behind Putin. And so, yeah, those are just very difficult problems. I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks, Jessica. Jean, do you want to?
Thank you.
If you can speak up loudly.
Yes, my name is Jean Dupré. I'm from CNS here in Monterey. Dr. Acker, thank you very much. As always, you know, the talks are very stimulating. I think Bill tried to put a positive spin to the atmospherics here. Unfortunately, the realist in me is going to be also a little bit pessimistic. But you asked a series of questions, and you started with no use. And I want to put no use, no threat on that line. And you also kind of identified me as a descendant about, you know, whether I believe in nuclear order. I believe that, well, realists believe. Morgenthau, for instance, said that the world is in a state of anarchy unless the most powerful take action. And I think in the nuclear order, that's very true. Now, if you think what's going on in Ukraine, you think about no use, no threat of use, and security assurances. That basically means that countries with nuclear weapons will refrain from using them or threatening to use them either against each other to maintain the world order. And we've lived in that order for 70 odd years. So I'm not sure that the world order, the nuclear order is broken. I think the nuclear order was really never there unless between the most powerful. But my comment here, and then I have two questions, is the whole idea of security assurances, especially the negative security assurances against the threat of use, I think was always flawed. It was a promise made, and a very solemn promise made by the nuclear weapons states, including at review conferences, that they will not threaten to use or threaten or use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are in, obviously, of full compliance with their non-proliferation obligation. But that's a paper tiger. I mean, it's written on paper, and if you see it doesn't. So what does it mean for security assurances by other nuclear states, or even other nuclear armed states? I always, as formerly representing a country that was at the forefront of negative security assurance debate, this was not about getting that assurance, actually. It was more about exposing the postures of nuclear weapon states that they can actually threaten anyone with their nuclear weapons. So that's my comment. So my question, you gave a very interesting talk yesterday on nuclear testing. And this is something that's been bothering me for a while. So you also said that you don't believe that there's a zero chance of Putin using a nuclear weapon or continuing threat. What would you think of the idea, as you said yesterday, that nuclear testing was often used as political messaging? Do you think that there would be a possibility of Russia resuming nuclear testing as a political signal? And of course, we know probably what will happen with other states using this to unravel the test ban. And then another comment, and I think this is what I try to be more positive, question is, you were involved with the Russians for decades, even during the dark days of the Cold War, and you've proven that you have made contacts with the North Koreans, and that dialogue is there. Where is that silver lining that you see for that dialogue? You mentioned the youth, but I mean, obviously it's not at the top leadership, not at the lab level. Where do you see that dialogue to restart the pilot line?
Let's see, let me turn first to the question of Russia and resumption of nuclear testing. Actually, I have not thought of that as a possible Russian action at this particular point. I've heard, a number of people say that one of the ways that Putin may use a nuclear weapon is as a demonstration, someplace. And that, I think, is highly unlikely. I mean, to blow it up somewhere in the general territory of Europe, take a small nuclear weapon just to show you that, hey, we're serious about this. I'd consider that, quite frankly, quite silly. We know he has nuclear weapons. We know their nuclear weapons work. And to go demonstrate it someplace that doesn't do anything. I hadn't thought about that they go back up to Novaya Zemlya and actually do a serious nuclear test. And we had a discussion here yesterday. I gave a presentation to Bill's class about the role of nuclear testing in the whole arms control and non-proliferation arena. And for example, the point that I made is from the U.S. standpoint, and again, this is sort of from the inside of a person who came from the nuclear complex, there are things I would like to be able to test right now. That would make me more comfortable with the safety, security, reliability of the U.S. arsenal. However, to do that, there's a lot of negative and a lot of risk associated with it, and that is that would give the license to the Chinese then to go test. And they need to test much more than the U.S. does because they've done 45 tests altogether and we've done 1,054 tests. But the Russians, I used to say, just point out, look, Russians done 715 nuclear tests, but they know every bit as much about nuclear weapons as we do. So I didn't see that it would make much difference one way or the other. However, that's changed in the past, I would say, 6 to 10 years. And that is, as you well know, the Russians have fielded a number of new weapons, or at least have said they've fielded a number of new weapons. Quite frankly, from my standpoint, I would sort of call that crazier than hell to go ahead and do that, with nuclear weapons. And so they may, without further testing, and so they may actually have a use for nuclear testing, could be one of their responses. I don't see how that's going to help them in Ukraine, but it just may be as an act of telling us that they can do that. Now, let's see, the second question specifically, let me make sure that I understand that better.
Well, it was, where is that silver lining that you see, given your experience in dealing with Russian scientists, North Korean, where's the silver lining that you could
How do we jumpstart the
pilot line?
Well, so first of all, as I had indicated, from the standpoint of the scientific and the military, that that common sense of destiny is still there. Certainly, that's sort of a silver lining that I look at, and I continue to stay in touch, and I think it's still there. However, from what I can see that's being done in Russia, is the whole suppression and disinformation campaign is so strong that it's sort of squeezing all of that out. And I can talk about the scientists, I can talk about the military. Bill can talk about the diplomatic world. Likewise, in the diplomatic world, there were many Russian diplomats that you could really have a decent conversation. You had the same sort of cooperative spirit. And so right now, I'm afraid I'm very pessimistic that the Putin government has cracked down so heavily that the scientists and to some extent, I think the military, particularly I'm talking about retired military, are just indeed afraid to speak up. And I don't know how to restart that pilot.
So let me tell you, we have a list now of 4 people, and let me identify them, and then we can kind of proceed. Justin, did you have your hand up also?
Yeah.
We may add, we have 5 now. So we have Hook, Kim. I can't. The squares are very little. Who's the first person in the upper left-hand corner? Oh, that's David. David, I just couldn't see you there. Okay, David McIntosh. We have Sophia, and then we have George Moore, and then we have actually one of our dual degree students from Russia, Konstantin. So let's take them in that order, and we'll see when Sig wants to.
I'll make the answers shorter.
Okay, so you want to start?
Thank you, it was really inspirational.
And you have to speak up so everybody can hear.
So my name is Chuck, and I work at the CNS as a research associate. So I think John already covered a lot of what I wanted to ask, but my question is, now we are talking about global nuclear order, then do you think that order is based on certain ethical or moral standard? And
On certain
ethical and moral standards.
a certain ethical and moral standard, and if so, how would you describe, how would you define it? And then second question is whether those can be maintained or upheld beyond U.S. national security or national interest. Third question is, from the ethical point of view, what is your view on positive security assurance? I think those are related to the cause of all the problems we have.
So let me start from the end of positive security assurance. I happen to think that's a very important part of the fabric of the nuclear proliferation regime. So I think that's a very important part. Of course, we have that issue today in relation to South Korea versus North Korea. And I've spent a lot of time in South Korea. I've spent time in North Korea. And so there, from my standpoint, the positive security assurance for South Korea is indeed something that I could bank on. I know there are a lot of South Koreans who are much more concerned about that. Okay, so let me again make sure that I hear the other questions, which I didn't do.
So basically, if the current global nuclear order is it based on certain...
Oh, yeah. So the global nuclear order. So actually the best thing on the global nuclear order is you read the various papers that Professor Jeffrey Knopf has written. So he's written lots about the global nuclear order, from a very nice sort of academic standpoint of actually saying, hey, look, this is how this order developed, here's what's involved. I'm much more of a practitioner. And so as I've looked at the global nuclear order, I look at the results of that, and that's why I went through the 4 things that I mentioned. We haven't had nuclear weapons used, there's got to be some orders. It's not written down anywhere, some people call it a taboo, but it hasn't happened, And then again, I look at the non-proliferation, I look at the nuclear terrorism. We haven't had nuclear terrorism. And then countries have worked together. For example, what the U.S. has done in order to make South Korea today, in my opinion, builds the best nuclear reactors in the world. How did they get there? it turns out, is very positive interaction with the United States of America. First combustion engineering, then Westinghouse, very, very closely working together. And so, that part has worked out well. The reason I actually asked the question to start with, is there a global nuclear order? In my opinion, there are a lot of countries that will say there is no order. It was discriminatory. You could talk to the Pakistanis and the Indians. Why did they develop nuclear weapons? Well, why can't they have nuclear weapons? Why the P5? Why do they have nuclear weapons? I explained yesterday, in terms of nuclear tests, they were the 5 countries that tested before the 1968, non-proliferation treaty. And I've had personal discussions with the North Koreans who have said, hey, look, what we do for nuclear, it's not for you to decide. It's not a right for you to give. We will decide what we want to do. And so particularly if you look at the global South in general, they're very, very, suspicious of what this global North, particularly led by the United States. And so I think actually, trying to convince the world that there is a global nuclear order is difficult. I would do it in the way that I just told you. The world could have gone to hell if we didn't have an order. So that's why.
It's quite interesting. If you look at the votes yesterday at the IAEA Board of Governors with respect to the resolution that was introduced by Canada and Poland, essentially condemning the Russian presence at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility, there were 7 countries who abstained, in addition to the Chinese and the Russians voting no. And they included South Africa, a champion of nuclear disarmament. Thank you, John. Egypt, and then India and Pakistan. And so I think it's important to look at those countries and then ask the question, why did they, in fact, choose to abstain on this issue? So it's just, I think, an interesting kind of fact.
20 years since I left the ministry.
I know you're not responsible there. So I think proceeding down my list here, David McIntosh. David's a student here and actually was the president of our NPT Review Conference simulation last year. He was more successful in bringing us to a consensus decision last year than our good friend Gustavo Slavinin. Circumstances were a little bit different, but David, you have the floor to ask your question.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, do the experts here, and I am not one of the experts here, think that it might help to decrease, at least somewhat, the risk of Russia using nuclear weapons to kill and destroy in Ukraine? For the US government right now, along with as many other governments it could recruit, to announce that any senior Russian officials and officers participating in carrying out a Putin order to use those weapons in Ukraine will be a war criminal and will be pursued and prosecuted as such, no matter how long it takes and no matter how long they live. Would that conceivably help? And I don't actually have a view that it would. I'm just curious.
I should mention David also is a lawyer, a Harvard Law School graduate. So I suspect his question, even if he doesn't want to answer it himself, is informed by some knowledge of the law. But go ahead, Sig, if you want to respond to that.
So my colleague Scott Sagan at Stanford and his law professor colleague Alan Weiner have actually made that very proposal. So they've actually said precisely that's what ought to be done, and they felt that it would make a difference. I must say my immediate reaction was I didn't think so. That just that legal threat would change their behavior. What I think is more likely is actually what I call the civil society part of them. That they may actually by themselves say, I've spent my life in this nuclear business, and we have to work together to make sure that we can actually survive all of this, and I'm not going to do this. So they may just draw on their own, moral objection rather than on the legal objection. So from a legal standpoint, I don't know whether it would make a difference.
Thank you. Sophia, calling from Washington, D.C., I suspect, if you'd like to ask a question.
That's right. Hi, Sig. I'm Sophia Petit. I'm a research assistant at the CNS in DC office. I really appreciated your comments on global nuclear order. And for background, I was previously at the Small Arms Survey and the Global Decolonization Initiative, which sort of informs my impressions of the global nuclear order, which just, I believe that there was a global nuclear, there is, or at least was global nuclear order, and it was discriminatory, but that doesn't mean that an order didn't exist or doesn't still exist in whatever state that might be. So thinking about that context, I'm really thinking about what this invasion means for non-proliferation, and thinking about when we've just seen a nuclear armed state invade a non-nuclear armed state with a nuclear threat at its back as it invades, and thinking about the timing in which that happened. And obviously the invasion was unfortunate, whatever timing it happened, but I think it's particularly unfortunate that we see the invasion happening not too far after the Trump presidency and sort of the weakening of US commitment to its allies in terms of military alliances. And thinking about all of these factors together, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on non-proliferation and what that means for a future approach to non-proliferation, because the approach to non-proliferation that the US led throughout the past 50 years of the nuclear order might not be the most suited for the nuclear order as it is changing now post Russia's invasion. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that and any thoughts on how US approach to continuing pushing forward non-proliferation needs to adjust to the context that we live in now.
Well, that's the question I came to ask myself. So your own thoughts and the thoughts of your colleagues here, are very important from my perspective. So indeed, what happened in Russia certainly weakens this idea of having a negative security assurance, of having a nuclear power invade a non-nuclear power, particularly after having promised not to do so. Those are all steps in the wrong direction. Your comment about this being done, after the Trump presidency and whether that actually had something to do with sort of the weakening, I guess I would almost view it the other way. The way that Trump viewed the role of NATO was such that I just don't see that would have changed things in a way to make it more likely for Russia to invade. Again, just on the basis of everything I know, that decision that Putin made to invade, is based on so many things that are within Putin's mind. I have my own views as to why and what he did, being welcomed in Ukraine, of liberating the Russian-speaking people. But I don't know. To me, it's just complex, and so I don't have a good answer. It's not a good sign for the non-proliferation regime. However, I must say, of having a country that has nuclear weapons and then go ahead and invade another weapon, another non-weapon state. What other countries, particularly in the global South or the Middle East, might tell you, the U.S. doesn't have such a good record either, and so you have to factor that in as well. So a lot of the countries that are not lining up with the United States are not lining up because, in essence, they say, "Hey, look what the U.S. has done, over the past 30 years," and so that works against them. But I don't have a good answer to your question.
Thanks. I think, Sophia, if I understood Sophia's question or her line of thinking, I don't think she was suggesting that the actions of the Trump administration made it more likely that Russia would intervene, but that they may have been damaging to the non-proliferation regime because of the reduction in the credibility of the security assurances. But if I can just throw in also in response to some extent, Sophia, and I really feel uncomfortable pointing to anything optimistic, but so contrary to my nature. But I mean, again, pointing to the review conference, I mean, one might have expected more individuals to make comments that, you know, given the behavior of Russia, given the behavior of the other nuclear weapon states, that the regime doesn't mean as much to us, that we're going to have to rethink our own stance with respect to the value of nuclear weapons in our security policies. And one really didn't see statements to that effect. I mean, you never know what countries are thinking. But if you just examine the commentary of the states who participated in the meeting and read their statements, I don't think you would have guessed that this conference took place after the invasion of a non-nuclear weapon state by a nuclear weapon state, at least with respect to the value of the treaty to their own security and the importance of maintaining the non-proliferation treaty. So that was, you know, somewhat optimistic, my attempt at optimism.
Sophia, let me, in the spirit of what Bill just said, you know, perhaps the clarification of your comment. Certainly, if you meant to say that Trump in his presidency then actually did damage to the non-proliferation regime from the fact that certainly as if I would be sitting in South Korea or sitting in Europe, and the actions that Trump did and the things that he said particularly would certainly not make me comfortable with an American security guarantee. So that's certainly absolutely right. And that changed, of course, quite dramatically with Biden. But nevertheless, you know, Putin still went in for lots of other reasons.
Okay, we have George and Constantine, and I'm probably going to have to... Hannah, you want to... Okay, I'll take... That'll be the last three. Well, Sharad, okay, well, go on indefinitely here. We can be brief, one question per person, and then we'll try to be brief in the replies. George?
Mine's not a question, so you were asking for suggestions.
Yes.
And here's a suggestion. I thought about this a little bit.
This is George Moore speaking, by the way, just so...
I think that the nuclear security summits started under President Obama were a great format for discussing things. Unfortunately, they tailed off. There was an attempt to create an IAEA substitute of foreign ministers. If we were to do something currently now to reinstitute the World Nuclear Security Summits, I don't think it could be done with the United States sponsoring that, but a country like Japan or Brazil, getting countries together, heads of state together to discuss these issues in a kind of free format basis might be some way to begin to step forward, regardless of whether Putin remains in power or not. The Russians have too big an investment in nuclear power and sales of nuclear power to ignore such a conference. And if it isn't sponsored by someone who's directly confrontational to them, it could be a venue for beginning to break through some of these issues.
Yeah, let me just, George, from my side, I hadn't thought about that. Of course, I'm very familiar with the nuclear security summits. And of course, those were put in place primarily because of the concern about nuclear terrorism, you know, response to 9/11, you know, much later. And so President Obama really took the initiative to pull that together. It did provide a really good stage for countries to get together to discuss these issues with the potential of having very positive outcomes. So unlike, you know, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where you're still going to have 5 nuclear powers that are going to hang on to their nuclear weapons, and you always have that disparity there. In this case, you can actually come to a consensus because nobody wants to have nuclear terrorism, you know, anywhere on their territory. Perhaps with a bit of a less of a focus just on the nuclear terrorism part, but to get them together, led by somebody else, to have the discussion, I think it's a very good idea.
Thank you, George. And Sig, I think Constantine.
Yeah.
You want to introduce yourself for a second?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a third semester dual degree MA student. I'm BDS, and as Dr. Barr mentioned, I'm from Russia. And the thing I wanted to say that there was a statement by Putin that literally extended the provisions of the military doctrine and the fundamentals of nuclear policy by, let's say, hinting at a nuclear strike against those who might be tempted by the outside interference with the current events. Yeah, that's like a quotation. And this is something different from the aggression using conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened, as mentioned in the military doctrine of Russia. So, because now we're talking about the Russian actions in another country, actually. So, in your view, against the background of these like verbal developments of Russian doctrines, and we already know that the DPRK has passed the law allowing the preventive strike. They could be launched automatically. We can see any connection between that or not. But still, may other countries brought their military doctrines and their nuclear policy, and maybe that would lead us to a new level of nuclear risk. What's your opinion on that?
So, Bill, I must say I didn't hear enough of that. I have enough challenge hearings. I didn't quite. Can
Let me see if I can correctly, rephrase what you have been addressing here, Constantine. So I think one Constantine talked about some departure from formal Russian military doctrine due to the statements made by President Putin. And he also made reference to statements made and perhaps new legislation adopted by the DPRK with respect to nuclear weapons use. And so I think the question is, are we perhaps seeing greater risks evolving from the evolution of kind of nuclear doctrine as it's been made recently? Is that
Yes.
consistent, at least with what you said?
Yeah, and the way it would affect the strategic stability.
Okay.
Well, so the in the spirit of the Russian departure from foreign military posture, I'm not so sure how far that is from what was the Russian military posture, except in the way that it was just put out there as a threat. But the Russian military posture always had, or at least over the last 20 years, have had that the Russian have strategic weapons, to provide international strategic stability, and they have the local, the tactical weapons for regional stability. And it was quite clear that those tactical weapons are there both, for regional stability from a Russian standpoint, and also to sort of increase their sphere of influence that they can have. And so I think the Russians have had that there, that it's possible that they would use tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, under they would say the proviso of the threat to Russia and so forth, but then that's what Putin has called the Ukrainian special military observation. The North Korean change in the new law, I'm quite familiar with that. That's not anything terribly new as well. They just put it out there. They've made it very specific, and it's a message to us, particularly the United States. I don't think that was brought on by anything that happened in the Ukraine as such.
Okay, I think, I know there was another component of your question, but I'm a little bit concerned about the time here, Constantine. So what I would suggest here, if we here maybe get both, collect the two questions from Hannah and from Sharad, and then we'll let Dr. Hecker respond as he sees fit. So if you'd like to answer your question.
Hi, Dr. Hecker. My name is Hannah Harris from the United States. I'm in Dr. Potter's simulation this semester. And so I wanted to ask kind of if you have any lessons learned or stories from your career about interfacing between scientists and folks in politics and in diplomacy. Kind of specifically, one of the things that I've noticed, I'm an astrophysicist, and so when we talk to scientists from different countries, we always start with, initial conditions and assumptions. We have clear, discrete definitions for everything that we talk about. And so no matter who you are or where you're from, we can have a collective conversation because we all agree on the system in which we're operating. But with international relations, it seems so messy. We all have different understandings of each other's, the history of different countries. We even like the debate on rationality, for example. And so I just wonder, at least coming from science, it seems so overwhelmingly complicated to try to do anything in IR, essentially, just because of this whole issue, I guess. And I was wondering, how have you had any interaction with this type of challenge, or do you have any advice on how to interface between these two fields?
Thanks, Hannah. We'll save that question for a moment, and then Sharad, do you want to? Dr. Josie is a member of our faculty here.
Thank you, Dr. Hecker. I was trying to phrase this as a question, but it's ending up being more of a comment, and it's actually very related to what Hannah just put so articulately, which is the points that you've mentioned today, especially in context of the global nuclear order and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, makes me think of other related concepts like what it means to be a responsible nuclear weapon state or nuclear armed state. It may or may not have any immediate policy implications, but I think academically and conceptually, I think what is our understanding of what it means to be a responsible nuclear armed state, and with it, what kind of behavior would be termed as irresponsible. Thank you.
Let's see. That probably takes that would take a good part of the lecture. I guess keeping in the sense of the things that I mentioned, in terms of a global nuclear order. The no use, the no overt threat. In a sense, the nuclear weapons and heavy nuclear weapons, there's always the threat of use. That's how deterrent works. That the other side must feel threatened in order for them, not to do what you don't want them to do. And then all of those things associated with nuclear safety, with nuclear security, the safeguards of materials, and all of those things are part of being a responsible nuclear state. The issue as to what's happening at Zaporizhzhia, for example, that's not what you do. So I'm not sure I could write you down, the exact formula, but those are the crucial aspects of that. And it's actually interesting. As far as North Korea is concerned, since the new law was mentioned and Kim Jong-un gave a speech on September 8th related to that new law, and what they actually stress in that new law, essentially the essence of them being a responsible nuclear state. And I like your terminology, they are not a nuclear weapons state. There are only 5 of those, by the NPT, but they are a nuclear armed state, right? Okay. So the question of the scientists, and the diplomats and politicians. My sense and my experience has been, by working these issues as a scientist with other scientists, that actually scientists play an important role. But they can't do that without the political cover. So, for example, the things that we did with the Russians under the umbrella of the cooperative threat reduction, if we didn't have that umbrella, if there wasn't the funding, what we did with each other wouldn't have made much difference. We couldn't have gotten anywhere. We did remarkable things about the safety of nuclear weapons that were, intricate to the design of nuclear weapons. Didn't exchange secret information, but it was really important. And then the safeguarding of the materials, the facilities, and so forth. So what I found, and I found the same thing in North Korea, is I find it easier myself as a scientist, working with the scientists in the other country for the following reason, is that in the scientific and technical world, you can't BS each other. You know, it's not just such a messy thing. There's certain very specific things. So when I discussed the density of plutonium, with the North Korean nuclear director, he can't go off and say, he either knows it or he doesn't know it. So what happens is you wind up having respect for the other side. And then my view is once you have respect, it's much easier to build the trust that you need to actually get something done. So that's, I think, where the scientists come in. And what I've always argued for is the scientists and then the diplomats have to work together. In my book in North Korea, as Bill just mentioned briefly, the book is done. It's with Stanford. It's gone to the printer, but it's not going to be publicly released till February. But the book really features that theme of it's important to have the technical and the diplomatic world work together, and especially in the diplomatic world to make sure there's some aspect of a technical risk analysis. And what I try to demonstrate in the case of North Korea, we didn't do that job. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. I mean, there's so many interesting questions that have been put forth here, and I'm always tempted to intervene, and I'm not going to do so this afternoon. But the good news is that, unlike the past, Dr. Hecker is now kind of formally connected with us. We can continue this conversation, and we will do so later in the semester. And so I just want to be express my great appreciation for Sig coming here in person today. And if you'll join me in welcoming our distinguished professor of practice. So thanks so much. And thanks to everybody.
All of you.